In section 2.2, we're going to be solving quadratic equations algebraically, and we're going to do this 4 different ways. We're going to do it by factoring. We're going to do it by taking the square root of both sides. We're going to do it by completing the square, and we're going to do it by using the quadratic formula. So the first example here, I have given you, we are going to solve this quadratic by completing the square. So here we have the standard form of a quadratic formula, and you notice that it does have its quadratic term, which was this, and that a cannot be 0, and it can't be 0 because if it were 0, it wouldn't have the quadratic form, quadratic term. So when you're solving a quadratic equation by factoring, you're going to use the zero product property, which says that if a times b is 0, then either a is 0 or b is 0, or both a and b are 0. So here I have an example, this equation. And the first thing you want to do when you're using factoring to solve is you want to get set the equation equal to 0. So I've got 2x squared plus 11x minus 6 equals 0. So there I have it so that it's equal to 0. And then once I have that, then I'm just going to factor. And if you use guess and check, then you do something like this. You know you want 11x in the middle, so that's going to be a plus 6 here and a minus 1 here. And if you were to check these terms, that gives you negative 1x. If you multiply these, that gives you 12x. And if you add those, 11x, you should get that guy. Okay, so it does work out, so it's factored correctly. And so now I'm going to use, I'm just going to rewrite this over here. Now I'm going to use my zero product property to actually solve it. So by the zero product property, 2x minus 1 could equal 0, or x minus x plus 6 could equal 0. And if 2x minus 1 equals 0, then x is going to be a half. And if x plus 6 equals 0, then x is going to be negative 6. And those are my two solutions. Okay, so that's solving by factoring. Now we're going to be solving by taking the square root of both sides, and I have two examples here. In the first one, I only have a quadratic term. I don't have a linear term. And in the second one, which you'll notice is the square is completed here, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But when you have one like A, where you just have a quadratic term, it's very convenient to just take the square root of both sides. And what we'd want to do in this case is first, if you can, isolate the quadratic term, and we do that by dividing both sides by 4, and you get x squared is equal to 2. And then once you have x squared is equal to 2, you take the square root of both sides, make sure you use plus or minus, so x is going to be positive or negative root 2. Okay? And then the other example that you'd have is when you have the square completed like I have here. And then what you want to do is, again, isolate that piece. So we divide both sides by 3. And once we do that, we get x minus 2 quantity squared is equal to 9. And then once that squared term is isolated, you take the square root of both sides, positive or negative, and that's going to give us x minus 2 is equal to positive or negative 3. And now we solve for x, so x is going to be 2 plus or minus 3. And if x is 2 plus 3, then x is 5. If x is 2 minus 3, then x is negative 1. And those are our two solutions here. Okay, so that's solving by taking the square root of both sides. And now we're going to look at solving a quadratic equation by completing the square. Now, by completing the square, what I mean is making that equation look like this. So the first deal when you're solving by completing the square is to make it look like this. And then once it looks like that, you've got to go through all of these steps that you did here. So let's go back and look at our example. In this case, I have this equation, and I want to complete the square, make it look like it did on the previous slide. So when you have that coefficient 8 here, you're going to have to factor that out. So there are a couple of things to do. First of all, I want to get the quadratic and the linear term together on one side and move the other term over. And I'm going to put a blank because I'm going to add something in each of those blanks. And then whenever this right here is, this coefficient is a number other than 1, we need to factor it out. So I'm going to factor that 8 out of the entire equation. And when I do that, I get x squared minus 3x. And then I'm going to have my blank equals, if I factor that 8 out of that, negative 3, then I get negative 3 over 8. And then I get a blank, and then I'm going to close my brackets. Now from here, we take this middle term and divide it by 2, or multiply by 1/2. Okay, and then once you have that, you take that term and you square it. In this case, it gives us 9/4. Okay. Now that 9/4, whatever that number is always going to be positive. And this number goes here and here. So that's a plus 9/4. That's a plus 9/4. Okay, now once I have that done, I have everything I need to write my equation in the form I want to write it in. So something squared is equal to blank, okay, bracket. So let's go back to the previous slide to see. Okay, so I want it to look like this. All right. So the way you see the values go in there are, this is an x. This value here is always going to go here. So that's minus 3/2. And then to get, if you simplify that, you get this. And in this case, that's going to give us 15/8. Okay, so once I have that, then my square is completed, and I actually only need this part to solve my equation. I just go through the steps like I did on the previous slide. So I've got x minus 3/2 quantity squared is equal to 15/8. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and this is plus or minus, and once I do that, I get x minus 3/2 is equal to positive or negative square root of 15/8. I'm going to go ahead and simplify that to root 15 over 2 root 2. The square root of 8 is 2 root 2. And then I solve for x, and I get 3/2 plus or minus root 15 over 2 root 2, which is fine, or I can rationalize that. This is fine, but if I rationalize it, I multiply by root 2 over root 2 to get that radical out of the denominator. And when I do that, I get x is equal to 3/2 plus or minus root 30 over 4. Okay, and this is fine. Okay, so there we have solving by completing the square. And now we're going to solve by using the quadratic formula. So we should all be familiar with the quadratic formula by now, knowing that this part here, this the radicand, is the discriminant, and it can be positive or negative or 0. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. So I have 2 examples here, and I'm going to solve each one of these by completing the square. In the first one, I have a is 1, b is -10, and c is -13. So if that's the case, then x is going to be negative b, which is 10, plus or minus square root b squared, which is 100, minus 4, times a, which is 1, times c, which is -13. And now I just need to simplify, and this is all over 2 times a. I need to simplify this. It's going to give me 10 plus or minus the square root of 152 all over 2. And then I can simplify that square root of 152 to 10 plus or minus 2 root 38 over 2. And then you notice that all of your terms have a factor of 2 in them, so I can divide everything by 2. And when I do, I'm going to get 5 plus or minus root 38. And this would be, these would be my 2 solutions in this case. Now let's look at the other one. In this example, A would be 3, B would be -5, and C would be 2. And so x is going to be negative b, which is going to be 5, plus or minus the square root. And b squared is going to be 25 minus 4 times our a times our c. All of that is over 2 times a. And then I just simplify from here, and I get 5 plus or minus the square root, and that's going to give me square root of 1 over 6. So I get 5 plus or minus 1 over 6. And when I simplify that, I've got 5 plus 1 over 6, and I get 5 minus 1 over 6. So I get two solutions, 1, and I also get 4/6, which is 2/3. And those are my two solutions. So that's factoring using the quadratic formula. And that's all I have for section 2.2.